How would another 4 years of the Biden administration affect your retirement? Or the Trump administration, or the Haley administration? Stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels. And today, we're talking about the elections. You're going to learn everything you need to know about how a Trump administration, a Biden administration, or a Haley administration will affect your retirement financially. Not. And the reason we're not going to do that is simple. It's really hard if you're invested the right way for any one 4-year period or any one administration to affect your retirement. However, we are going to address some of the things that can affect your retirement in the coming years, some of the financial issues that we really do need to be concerned about.
Yeah, that's right, Dave. It seems like maybe all of the other TV shows out there are talking about how the New Hampshire primary is going to affect this and what the new president would mean or what another President Biden would mean. But really, the point is that elections don't really affect your money necessarily. And that's, of course, if you're invested the right way. But first, Dave, of course, it's great to be here with you. And it's great to be here with all of our listeners out there. And I hope you're having a great weekend so far and a great week.
Everything's great. Yeah, well, we got to attend. It was the first for me. Our good friend and co-worker, Richard, we got to attend my first Egyptian wedding that I've ever experienced. Was that your first too?
That was my first, and that was very exciting. And I felt honored that we got to share that.
I felt honored also.
Very nice.
And I got to say one thing, if you've never been to an Egyptian wedding, man, they love to party. I will tell you right from the very beginning when they introduced the bride and groom, everybody's on the dance floor and they never left. So it was a lot of fun. It was good to see.
It was so much fun. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny because we came from a background, as you know, Sarah, where we had the television show. It was on a highly politically charged station, and we try to be apolitical on the show because, retirement isn't a political issue, right? People, if you think about it, I mean, Democrats want to have a nice retirement. Independents want to have a nice retirement. Republicans want to have a nice retirement. In fact, it's the level to which the television station we were on was politically charged was so extreme that it was one of the major reasons why we didn't renew, right?
Right, and that was a couple years ago, actually.
Yeah.
We had a video on our YouTube where you kind of explained the reason why, that this show is not meant to be political. It's not meant to be one of those shows that you would see on a regular station as well. Like our goal, Dave's goal, is to really educate you and make sure that you understand the best way that, in our opinion, that you should invest for retirement.
That's right. And there are issues that are important when it comes to voting, issues such as pro-life or pro-choice, or whether you're pro-green policy, or maybe you haven't quite been sold on that yet. But when it comes to your actual dollars, I mean, every president wants to have a good economy. Right now, President Biden's approval rating is at a record low, and a big part of it is because of the economy, because with inflation, people's paychecks just don't go as far anymore. So anyways, we'll be hitting all that today as we address the issues that do apply to your retirement.
Well, you mentioned the economy, Dave, and our first Ask Dave question actually comes from Tom in Florida. And he says, isn't it true that Republican presidents typically do better for the economy than Democrat candidates?
It's interesting. The economy or the stock market. I mean, I guess I've heard both rumors, and they really are rumors, because if you go back in history and you think about some of this, we had mostly a great economy and great stock market during Ronald Reagan for 8 years. But then it wasn't as great during President Bush, the elder Bush. And then President Clinton came in, and all the people who believe this theory thought, oh boy, the economy is going to be rough, the stock market's going to be rough. And people made more money in the financial markets in their 401ks in that 8-year period at the end of the 20th century than ever before. So in reality, it's not true. In fact, then you go to the second Bush, right? The second Bush presidency, George W. I guess I got to say George W. He didn't. That was Republican administration, and the stock market did poorly. I mean, over 8 years, a lot of people lost as much as half of their liquid net worth had they been invested, let's say, in the S&P 500. And then the Obama administration comes in, boom, stock market takes off again. So it's really a myth, because every president wants a good economy, because people do vote their wallets. Yes, they vote their ideals, but if their wallet is hurting, somehow the ideals tend to take a back seat. And I believe that with our checks and balances we have right now between the three branches, that one person sitting in the White House, it's really hard for that person to screw up the economy or the markets to any significant degree or in any irreparable way in just a 4-year period.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave email. And if any of our listeners out there have a retirement question that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email at askdave@Retirement Income Source. That's SOURCE.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today's show is really about how elections don't actually always affect your money, especially if you're invested the right way, if you're invested for income. And Dave has covered so far a little bit why a president doesn't have as much influence as people think. Or, they're only in charge for 4 years. There's also Congress as well, and Congress decisions when it comes to making laws. There's a big balance of power there. But one of the main things that does affect the president and his likability, right, is inflation. And that's one of the issues that we've seen recently with President Joe Biden, the current economy, a lot of inflation going on.
Yeah, and again, that's why his popularity is down in the polls. And they're actually talking about the possibility of President Trump being able to come back and beat him in the next election. It's long, we have a long road ahead of us because people do vote their wallets. And even though inflation has come down, and we'll talk later in the show, Sarah, about why I don't think inflation is a big long-term concern. But even though inflation has come down, you have to remember that inflation is still baked in. So if the cost of everything went up 15% over a 2-year period, just because inflation is back down the 2 to 3% range, doesn't mean that you don't have to pay that extra 15%, right? What we've done is we've established a new baseline for the price of goods and services and all that. So you might remember, we spoke, I know you remember, Sarah, we spoke back with this whole argument a couple years ago, is this inflation more permanent or is it more transient, right? And my take on it was always simple, that inflation is always permanent and it's always transient, right? Because the rates don't stay at 5 to 10% inflation forever. They come back down to a normal level. But so it's always transient in that regard, but it's always permanent because when prices go up, they hit a new level and they very seldom come back down again.
Right. And right. People don't lower prices on goods and services, and that becomes an issue. And it really affects people overall. And inflation is one of those things that can actually affect your retirement a lot more than elections, in fact, if you haven't planned ahead for it.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. But again, like you said, if you're invested for income, it's not as much of an issue, especially if you're invested in things like bonds and preferreds. If you're invested in high dividend stocks of good companies that are unlikely to cut dividends, again, you're unlikely to be affected. But if you're invested in a total return, for total return, and you haven't made that transition to an income first, growth second approach as you approach retirement, then yes, it can make a difference because, presidential policies can affect certain sectors of the markets, whether it's the financials or whether it's the pharmaceuticals and so on. So we're going to be talking about that coming up, and also about inflation, about interest rates, and really the things that you need to be concerned about when it comes to planning for your retirement. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and we appreciate you listening to today's show because a lot of our listeners, they get worried every 4 years or so when there's going to be a new president in the White House. They worry how it's going to affect their money down the road and how it will affect their retirement. But really, Dave, today's show is all about how the election doesn't necessarily affect your retirement if you're invested the right way. Now, of course,
that's right.
Elections are important. We want to encourage everyone to vote based off your values and what's important to you, but it doesn't always affect your money.
And I can't tell you how many times I've heard potential clients say, well, I want to hold off on any changes till after the election. And, I always chuckle because it's really not that big of an issue. I remember people who thought the world was going to end when President Trump got elected and the world didn't end. And then people thought the world was going to end when President Biden got elected and it didn't end. and it never ends, But so obviously, like we said, there are important issues for you. You might have issues, again, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. Right, that's an important issue. It may not be a retirement issue, but it's an important issue for you. Whether you are very green in terms of how you think, or whether you haven't been sold on that yet, or whether you like or don't like a particular stance that maybe our government's taking with Israel right now, what's going on with the Hamas conflict, or what's going on with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So those are important voting things. But in terms of your money, you're right, Sarah, if you're total return focused still and you're within 10 years of retirement, then you're taking some chance because, you can, sectors do matter, okay? Because financial, for example, there's certain policies that do better, for financial stocks and certain policies that do worse. There's certain policies that do better for technology and certain policies that do worse. There's certain policies that do better for pharmaceuticals and some that do worse. So if you're based on total return, you've got to be careful with that. You might have to shift your balance of money from one sector to another. But let's say you're in stocks, right? And you're just living off the dividends, or you plan to live off the dividends. You're in a high dividend stock portfolio, right? We always talk about how you can get 4 or 5% dividend in a common stock portfolio, right? We do that pretty much every day, and we've done that consistently for our clients. So if you can get that kind of yield, then you don't care about the total return. If an administration comes in that maybe isn't good for a particular sector, okay, you're still getting the income, you're still getting the dividends. And that's really the key to being positioned properly so that, you don't have to have your retirement affected by the Electoral College. And, for me, when I set a goal, I don't want the outcome of my goal to be affected by influences outside of my control. And if I'm one out of, hundreds of millions of votes, guess what? That's outside of my control.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's the goal of our show to really educate our listeners, too, so they understand why investing for income can lead to a more worry-free and a more stress-free retirement instead of focusing on total return. But you mentioned living off the dividends, Dave. And our next Ask Dave question actually has to do with this topic of dividend stocks. So we have Candace from Washington State. She says, if I'm invested in dividend stocks and those are in those sectors that are typically affected by politics, how do I know when to get out?
Well, the only real concern you need to have, and I'm sorry, I missed the name there again for the
Candace.
Candace, okay, Candace. Again, the whole point is you shouldn't have to get out. The real question is, are you in companies that are unlikely to cut their dividends? Right. So you have to look into a couple things. First of all, you have to make sure that it's a company that has a track record of dividends being important. And they'll talk about how important the dividends are, maintaining the dividend. And for example, you might even look at something called the dividend aristocrats, where for the last 40 or 50 years, they've constantly grown the dividend. They've never decreased the dividend. That's one way. But Candace, you can't stop there, because the other thing you've got to be careful of is, are dividends coming out of cash flow, or are they coming off the balance sheet? What do I mean by that? Well, some companies are so dividend focused, they don't want to disappoint shareholders by cutting dividends, that they're literally paying dividends out of cash on their balance sheet. They're not paying them out of cash flow for operations. So to me, you always want to look at the earnings of the companies and the cash flow from operations, and make sure that the dividend is significantly less than that. That not only are they able to pay the entire dividend out of income or out of cash flow, but moreover, there's a buffer so that if their income were to drop, they can still continue to pay that dividend. Because again, if it's paying it off the balance sheet, where they're just taking some money out of their savings and checking accounts, so to speak, to pay that dividend, then that's not going to last forever.
Well, Candace, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers out there have a question about retirement or finances, something that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we're talking about things that can actually affect your retirement more so than who will be the next president. And there's a lot of things that really go into that, especially the way that your investments are allocated. If you're looking at a total return focus, if you're not focused on income and you're invested in the wrong sectors that are affected, then you could potentially have some problems there. But overall, Dave, most of our listeners, I think, they don't want to have to worry, right, every 4 years about who's going to be president, especially when you're trying to enjoy your retirement and have fun.
That 100%. And that's why you don't really have to vote your wallet as much as you vote your conscience and other issues. And as a financial guy, our listeners might be thinking, God, that's kind of crazy to hear. But it's really true. So again, we just talked to Candace, right? Yeah. We talked about how if you're in the stock market, it's really about picking good companies. And see, there's a difference here. Some people pick stocks what's called top down, and some people pick stocks bottom up. Top down is where you're looking at the macro economy and you're saying, okay, well, what sector is going to do better? Are we going to get into inflation? And they lead with that. And then they try to pick the better companies in those particular sectors. The problem with that is it's really hard to predict. I mean, right now, half the economists think we're going to have a recession and half think that we won't. And the Fed thinks we're going to miss a recession. And so far, the data seems to show that. But the reality, Sarah, is that you don't know, because all these hikes in interest rates we've seen over the last 2 years, they're not fully baked into the system yet. There's a lag effect. Just like you could argue there's a lag effect that one president's policies can affect the economic headwind or tailwind of the next presidency, right? So it's not only what that president does, sometimes it's what the previous president does. There's a lag effect. And the same is true of these interest rate hikes. So in that regard, the other approach to doing a macro top-down type way of looking at stocks is to do bottom-up, is to do bottoms-up securities valuation, to look at the companies and look at healthy companies. And then you don't have to have as much of a crystal ball as to what the economy is going to do, or what geopolitical influences are going to do, which is always a wild card. Now you just have to look at, okay, are these healthy companies? And if you're a dividend investor, are these companies that are healthy in terms of how they pay dividends? Do they have a focus on dividends? Are dividends important to them and to their shareholders? And if they are, then you don't care as much about the price in the short term, because it's not going to affect your retirement from day to day.
Right. And I think that's the most important thing. You don't want your retirement to be affected day to day. You don't want to have to be tuned. If you love the news, maybe it's for you. But most people, I think, don't want to have to be tuned into the news every single day just to track what's going on and be worrying at night about how it's going to actually affect their bottom line. And it's very difficult to predict, Dave. You mentioned the interest rates. Those aren't built in yet. Even who the president is and their decisions, those can take up to a year, sometimes even longer than that, to actually see the effects. So it becomes difficult for people to try to plan out ahead of time because there's so many variables you can't control.
That's right. That's right. And so what are the variables? What are the things that we really need to look at that can affect someone's retirement? Okay, well, obviously inflation is one that we're going to make sure we cover today, inflation. The second one, which is a cousin to inflation, is interest rates, right? A third is recession, right? Possibility of recession. And I would say a fourth one, and this could get a little political, is where you start to talk about a pro-business or a pro-capitalism stance, Sarah.
That's right, Dave. Well, inflation, interest rates, recession, and a pro-business stance, these are all things that can actually affect your retirement. We'll talk about them coming up. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to The Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you have concerns about who the next president is going to be and you're worried how it might affect your retirement and your money, well, we're here to really put your fears at ease, because the president, he doesn't have as much power as you might think that he does. But there are several things that can affect your retirement, including inflation and interest rates. So, Dave, let's talk about inflation first, because this is really the silent killer of retirement plans.
Well, first you said the president is a he, so it sounds like you're not giving Nikki Haley too much of a chance at the White House here, and I'm kind of surprised.
We haven't had a female president yet, so historically, yes, President of the United States has always been a he.
We need to be a little woke here on the show. We have to.
Hey,
be
we're
politically
sticking away
correct.
from politics, Dave. This show, there's none of that here.
of course, at the wedding last weekend, if you're just joining us, we had the pleasure of going to our first Egyptian wedding last weekend with a good coworker of ours, and it was a great experience, a lot of fun, and so on. And of course, at one point, I wanted to get up from the table and I wanted to go request a song. You might remember, "Walk Like an Egyptian." And Sarah literally grabbed me by the collar and held me back. Wasn't going to allow me to go up and do that. So much for woke this weekend. But you're right. The things you do have to worry about, inflation and interest rates. And Sarah, I want to talk about those together because they're tied together, right? When inflation is high, the Fed has to raise interest rates to combat inflation. So inflation's high, interest rates are high. And the reason I believe that that's something we don't need to worry about as much as people think is, every area of the government and the Federal Reserve wants to keep inflation down, right? Again, presidents want to get reelected, and this high inflationary period is probably a thing that's hurting President Biden the most in his popularity polls. So that's one thing. But also think about if we have high inflation for a long time. When our national debt comes due, it's going to come due and get refinanced at higher interest rates. And we keep borrowing and borrowing more money, and that's one thing that has to get in order. We need to exercise fiscal austerity because we can't do it forever, right? Think about our listeners, Sarah. If you were to just say, okay, I've gotten raises every year, so I'm going to keep taking on more debt, because I anticipate getting a greater raise in the future, then, well, heck, I'm just going to I'm okay. I'm just going to keep taking on more debt. I'll get more raises. But then what happens all of a sudden if you don't get a raise?
Well, you end up in trillions and trillions of dollars of debt.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Everybody's assuming that the economy is going to continue to grow at a rate to cover the additional debt, and that works until it doesn't work anymore. So that's a problem. The national debt is a problem, and us getting our austerity measures in place as a country is an issue. I don't know how that's ever going to happen as long as politicians are politicians because they want to spend. But as far as inflation's concerned, we can't afford to have a high inflation rate, Sarah, because if we do, then again, as our debt comes due and we have to refinance it, if we double the interest rate, we double the debt payment, and we simply won't be able to do it. We'll spiral out of control. So that's why I'm not as concerned about inflation or about how any particular president could affect inflation adversely on the macro level.
Yeah. Well, we covered inflation and interest rates, and another huge thing that can actually affect your retirement is recession. So our next Ask Dave question comes from Darren in Wisconsin. He says, if I'm invested properly for income, how bad can a recession really hurt me?
Okay, Darren. Well, I guess it depends where you are. If you're invested for income and you're 5 to 10 years out of retirement. So maybe you're not there yet. You need to get some more income. You need to reinvest that income. You need to grow your money organically. We call it growing your money the old-fashioned way. And if you need to do more of that, and there's a recession, the good news is if the stock market goes down or the investments go down in value, you can actually now buy more shares when you reinvest those interest and dividends, which means that when things come back, you might be able to retire sooner. So that's pretty good. The negative, though, is there are lots of layoffs in recessions. And if the unemployment rate goes up, and Darren, you're one of the more senior, more highly paid people at your company, then you might have a target on your forehead. And if you end up getting laid off because laying off the higher paid person, the more senior person will cut more expense than a new person, well, then you might be forced into retirement early. So that's one way it can affect you adversely if we go into recession and you're not retired yet, and you need a few more years to let those dividends reinvest to grow your future income. Okay? If you're in bonds and bond-like instruments, let's say, and interest rates go down, it means now that your future growth won't be as fast on your income, because now when that income gets reinvested, you're going to be paying a little bit more for bonds, because when interest rates go down, bonds go up, which means the future growth assumptions might be just a little bit slower than you thought. So you might have to work an extra year or two. So again, the beauty about it, though, Darren, is those are small effects, right? We're talking about, with the exception of losing your job, those are small effects on your inflation. And the really good news is that if you're retired and you're living off interest and dividends, then again, if you're invested the right way, a recession should not affect your retirement at all.
Well, Darren, I hope that helps. And thank you so much for sending in your question for Dave. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers have a retirement question or maybe a question about finances in general that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you for spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and we've been doing something a little bit differently on today's show. We've been actually talking about how who the president is doesn't really affect your retirement if you're actually invested the right way. Of course, if you're invested heavily in the stock market, there could be some issues there due to the stock market being more emotional and going up and down. But if you're invested for income, you shouldn't have to worry as much. But there are things, Dave, we've covered that really will affect your retirement. The biggest things: inflation, interest rates, and even recession.
And again, I don't worry about inflation and inflation as much because we have an axe to grind as a country to do everything we possibly can to keep inflation down. Now I will tell you the one time inflation can get out of control, and I'll mention this, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because as a listener, you really can't plan to protect yourself from this, is if we really get concerns from other countries about our ability to repay our national debt. And if that happens and our currency gets significantly devalued, then we'll have inflation. And by the way, that is the definition of inflation, as you know, Sarah, is when people think, okay, yes, it's too much money chasing too few goods, but it's really a devaluation of a currency, right? If one country's currency gets devalued relative to the others, then you need more units of that currency to buy the same goods and services. It's really a devaluation of the currency. So as long as we stay as one of the stronger currencies, or as I like to say, the cleanest dirty shirt in the world's economic hamper, right, then we shouldn't have to worry about long-term hyperinflation. So do your children or maybe grandchildren might have to worry about it? Sure, it could happen that at some point other countries are stronger than us financially and our currency gets devalued, whereas other countries don't, and that causes hyperinflation in our country. I mean, that's happened in certain countries during the world wars, each world war, because that a particular country's currency got devalued, and they had hyperinflation for many, many years. But I don't see that happening during the lifetimes of any of our listeners.
One of the big things, though, with inflation is when it comes to healthcare inflation, right? Because we know that the rate of healthcare costs, healthcare inflation, increases significantly faster at a higher rate than inflation. And that will affect people a lot of times. As we know, most people, as you get older, unfortunately, you're going to need more medical care. So that is something you should plan ahead and think about.
Yeah, and if somebody's healthy, I mean, looking for, first of all, getting the right Medicare supplement plan, right, when you're 65 years old, and that could change, by the way, as you get older, but each year looking to make sure you have the right plan for you and for your needs, and then also looking into long-term care insurance. I know it's expensive, but the reason long-term care insurance is expensive is because long-term care is expensive, right?
Absolutely, very expensive.
So you really have to, it's something to look into. Now, if you're not healthy, you can't get it. You have to be in pretty good health. Or if you just have barely enough money to retire, you might not be able to afford the insurance. But the other thing, too, is that it's interesting how the stages of retirement work, right? In the early stages, we call the go-go years, you're spending more money. You're out there and you're traveling and spending money on lots of things. But as you get older, you do less of that. So those expenses start to go away and get replaced by medical expenses. So the hope for those who can't get long-term care insurance is that, one expense gets replaced with another, and all in all, it's not terribly devastating.
Well, we've talked about inflation, interest rates, and recession as things that can actually affect your retirement. We said earlier, Dave, that the president doesn't have as much power as people really thinks he does. But if he has a pro-business stance, that actually is something that could potentially affect your retirement, the president's outlook on business and how they feel about him as well. So we're going to explain coming up. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels. And today we're talking about why your retirement depends 100%, and it's all about the president at the time. Not the president. The sitting president at any one given time has a lot less effect on your retirement than you might think. And over my career, I've heard so many times people say, well, I don't want to make any financial decisions until after the election. And frankly, I think that is a big, big mistake. If your money is not in line with your goals in your phase of life, waiting for an election makes absolutely no sense. And so far, we talked about how really voting for other things that you're concerned about do potentially make a lot of sense, right? Whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, whether it's green or you haven't been sold on the green energy concept quite yet, or whether it's about policies about Israel versus Hamas or about Russia versus Ukraine. Those are issues that, that are meaningful. But in terms of finance, right? We talked about interest rates and inflation and how I don't see that being an issue at all in either party because our whole country has an axe to grind to keep inflation low because if rates go up, interest rates go up, inflation goes up too much, then we simply won't be able to afford the interest on our own debt. But how about recession? We talked a little bit about recession there, and I think we should hit that just a little bit more.
Right. Well, recession is one of those things, again, just like inflation and interest rates that really affect everyone no matter their political affiliation. And of course, we're not seeing much agreement when it comes to the economists. If we're in recession, if we're heading towards a recession, it seems like everyone has a different plan. But Dave, explain maybe some ways that people can avoid having this fear about worrying in the future, worrying if there is a recession, since it is something outside of their control.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that most recessions, are less than 2 years, certainly less than 3 years. And so the market might start to falter on anticipation of recession, but then starts to come up again when we've hit bottom, when the Fed has lowered interest rates, and try to get us out of recession, we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the markets start to come back. So, typically, the longest I've seen is really 7 years from peak to peak with the markets for the market to drop and come back. So if you're within 7 years of retirement, you absolutely need to be concerned. Now I always say, Sarah, you need to make that transition from being total return focused to income first, growth second within 10 or 15 years of retirement. And the reason I say that is because we had, in the early 2000s, we had the market underwater for 7 years. It came up just momentarily and came crashing back down for another 6, right? But even if you go with the 7-year rule, that means that if you're more than 7 years out of retirement, okay, you don't have to worry about recession as much. However, if you're within 7 years of retirement, then you have to be a little bit concerned about it. But even then, understand that a lot of times things come back quicker. But, why leave it to hope? Why leave it to chance, right? Imagine you don't correct your portfolio for an income first, growth second approach. And now imagine with recession, you do lose your job and you become the higher paid person that gets let go of because this company's trying to cut back their expenses, right? Now it's a double whammy. So you can never control whether a company's going to give you that pink slip because you're too highly paid and they're trying to cut expense, but you can control what you do with your portfolio. And making that critical shift, Sarah, from being total return focused, irrespective of where it comes from, to being income first, growth second is the single best thing you can do to protect yourself from a recession if you're retired or within 7 years of retirement for sure.
Yep. And Dave, we mentioned a little bit earlier in the show that there was a way that the president can actually affect the economy, especially when it comes to your retirement down the road. And that really is his stance on business. And so our next Ask Dave question actually comes from Penelope in Arizona. She says, I feel like President Trump was very pro-business, and this seemed to really affect the economy and make it better overall. So he was influential.
Yes, and yes, it's true that maybe the way that a president can most affect the economy or affect the markets is being pro-business. That's good. Just like another way would be trying to control tax rates, right? If you try to increase tax rates or increase taxes on capital gains, that's bad for the financial markets, right? So there are things like that. But I will also say again that there's a lag effect on all of these things. And, you're right that President Trump was a pretty pro-business president, and that's helped. But you can argue that right now there have been some more anti-business strategies or business limiting strategies over the last few years. And the reality is that it really hasn't affected the markets adversely. Again, there's always a lag effect on that. But most importantly, if you're invested for income, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter because your income should be unaffected. If you're invested for income conservatively in what I call the universe of bonds and bond-like instruments, then it really doesn't matter because really and truly, if you're in bonds and bond-like instruments, Penelope, was it?
Penelope,
Yes, Penelope. If you're in bonds and bond-like instruments, then really, even if the stock of that company that you're in doesn't do well, as long as the company can still pay its debt, you're good. You're in good shape. So even if you're worried about, gosh, that company's going to end up cutting dividends on their common stock, if you're in bonds and bond-like instruments, it becomes even less of a concern. So there are enormous things that you can do to protect yourself, even in the case of an 8-year non-pro-business administration.
Penelope, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question, or really comment in this case. But if any of our listeners out there, or YouTube viewers, have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please send us an email. Send it to askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. And thank you for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you didn't know already, I have good news. You do not have to be a registered Republican or Democrat in order to invest for income. Investing for income is for everyone, really, despite their political affiliation. And I think that's the main theme of today's show, Dave, is really why politics don't have to matter and how there are things you can do now to make sure that they don't affect your retirement down the road.
That's right. And, our listeners sometimes might look and say, gosh, I listened to Sarah and Dave and, they make it sound like income is the answer to cancer. Well, if you're retired or close to retirement, it is the answer to financial cancer. It really, truly is.
Well, I would ask, is money not important? I mean, money is important because it's a tool to help you do things, right? You need money. People focus on money their entire lives. And income is money, right? But income is actually the money you're using to pay for those things in retirement when you don't have the job anymore.
That's right. When you're working, right, you take vacations out of cash flow. Even when you buy a car, you don't take money out of your 401k, at least hopefully not. You're even if you need a car payment, you're doing it out of cash flow. Everything's out of cash flow. It's out of income. And that shouldn't change in retirement. But so why do we need income as a cure to financial cancer? What is the actual financial cancer? Well, the financial cancer, unfortunately, is policies and things that financial advisors and investors were taught really since 1980, the beginning of the best bull market in U.S. history, where all the big firms really loved total return. And you got to think about it, Sarah. Everybody charges fees on investments, right? Even if you're a no-load fund family, there are some fees. And over time, the stock market outperforms everything else. Growth outperforms everything else. So these companies have an axe to grind to keep you more aggressively invested for longer, because over time, their revenues will grow more rapidly. And when the stock market did well in the 80s and 90s, it became, nobody realized they had cancer because the market was going up by double digits every year. And people were retired, and first of all, if they weren't retired, it didn't matter. If the market dropped, I remember people telling me back then, if the market drops, it's only going to be 1 year. I'll keep 1 year of my retirement expenses and savings, and it's only 1 year. It'll come right back. Oh, we saw in the early 2000s, it was 13 years underwater, right?
13 years total, absolutely.
And if you're retired and you're taking money out of principal, you're selling shares on a continuous basis, that cancer is going to grow out of control because not only are you spending principal, but when the market's down, you're spending twice as many shares to get the income that you need. And it's not income, it's really just cash flow. And that's important. We talked last week about how there's really 3 types of income, right? There's taxable income, the IRS's definition. There's income, cash flow, how much you get that your advisor sends you that you can spend when you're retired. And then there's income, which is interest and dividends. And, the cancer is when advisors send you money, cash flow, but not all of it comes from interest or dividends. Some of it is coming from an assumed and depending on growth every year, year after year. And we know that the markets don't go up every single year. So again, the cure to financial cancer is real simple. And that's making sure that you only live off the interest and dividends and you don't take a dime more. And frankly, you make that transition at least 7 years before retirement.
And part of the cure, of course, is education and making sure that you understand all of the different investment opportunities out there for you. So thank you so much for listening to the Retirement Income Source. If you enjoyed this show, if you want to share it with your friends, you can visit our website at retirementincomesourceradio.com.
We'd love it if you do that. And also, if you get a chance to go to an Egyptian wedding, I highly recommend it. Also, we really hope that you're back with us next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.